At 6:12, the corridor outside the junior nursery should have been empty. Yet a wooden cavalry toy lay in the center of the polished floor, wheels still slowly turning as if recently pushed. The duty royal guard stopped, studying it. Prince Louis was never allowed in this wing before morning briefing. The guard felt a stillness in the air that did not belong there.
The guard noted the time automatically, 6:12, because routine depended on precision, and precision was the spine of palace security. The corridor outside the junior nursery was illuminated by the muted amber of the early morning lights, designed to preserve night vision for staff moving between shifts. The air carried the faint chill of stone that had not yet warmed with daytime activity. Nothing should have been moving here, yet the small wooden cavalry toy rested in the center of the polished floor, its painted wheels turning so slowly that the motion was almost imperceptible. He approached without haste, boots silent on the waxed surface, eyes moving first to the doorways, then to the ceiling corners where the discreet camera lenses watched without blinking. The toy was familiar. He had seen it during ceremonial family days, kept usually in the private playroom 2 floors above. He crouched, not touching it, studying the faint disturbance in the polish where something small and light had passed, slight scuffs, the irregular marks of a child's shoes rather than an adult's stride. The realization formed gradually, without drama but with weight. Prince Louis had been here. Protocol dictated an immediate radio report, the activation of supervisory channels, and the preservation of the scene. Yet something in the stillness argued for a different sequence. If the prince had wandered, he could still be nearby, frightened or lost, and broadcasting an alert might flood the corridor with personnel before the situation was understood. The guard rose and began moving down the corridor, senses sharpened, attention divided between sound and absence of sound. The palace at that hour breathed quietly, distant ventilation, a faint hum from electrical systems, the occasional settling of ancient wood. He reached the junction where the corridor met a narrower service passage used mostly by maintenance staff. The lighting here was colder, fluorescent, less carefully maintained. A faint draft moved along the floor, carrying the smell of dust and old plaster. He paused, listening. No footsteps, no voices, only the soft whisper of air through unseen vents. He checked the wall-mounted access panel. The indicator light showed no recent authorized passage, yet the door itself stood very slightly ajar, not enough to be visible from the main corridor, but enough to break the seal of stillness. The guard felt the first clear pressure of unease, not fear, but the steady tightening of attention that came when patterns failed. He slipped through the door, closing it quietly behind him, and followed the passage deeper into the service wing, where the palace felt older, less ceremonial, more like the working structure it had once been. Pipes ran along the ceiling, and the air was cooler here. The passage turned once, then again, and with each step the guard measured the distance back to the nursery, calculating how far a child could reasonably have walked, how long it would take for a search team to cover these angles if called. He reached an intersection where a secondary camera should have covered the passage. The lens was in place, its small indicator dark. Not broken, powered but inactive. That detail settled heavily in his thoughts, and he became aware that the situation was no longer a simple matter of a child wandering. He continued forward, slower now, aware that he was moving into a space where the normal assurances of surveillance and oversight had quietly failed, and somewhere ahead, in the silent depth of the service corridors, there was still no sign of the prince. He retraced his steps only long enough to reach the nearest security terminal, recessed into the wall of a secondary junction. The screen glowed softly as he activated it, calling up the corridor feeds from the previous night. The system responded without error, but the timeline told a different story. At 2:47, the camera covering the nursery corridor showed routine stillness. At 2:48, the image froze for a fraction of a second, then resumed, but the timestamp advanced to 2:59, 11 minutes missing, not recorded, not flagged. The guard studied the playback again, confirming the gap. In theory, such a lapse should have triggered an automated alert to the control room, yet no such alert appeared in the log. He checked the escort records next, scanning entries with disciplined patience. Every authorized movement in the residential wing required documentation, even at night. There was no entry for any escort involving the prince, no maintenance work scheduled in the service passage, no recorded reason for camera interruption. The absence of data was precise enough to feel deliberate. He stood in the narrow passage, the cold light reflecting from the screen onto his face, and weighed his options. Reporting immediately would initiate a formal chain of command that could take valuable time before a physical search reached this area. Yet continuing alone carried its own risk. Protocol existed to prevent guards from operating without support in uncertain conditions. He closed the terminal and stood for a moment in the quiet, listening again to the faint sounds of the building. Far away, somewhere above, a door closed softly, the sound traveling through ducts and stone in a way that made distance difficult to judge. He imagined the prince walking here in darkness, following voices or light, small footsteps echoing in corridors never meant for children. That thought sharpened his resolve. He began a methodical search, moving through adjoining passages, checking each door, each recess, each branching corridor. At one point, he found a faint smear on the wall at the height of a child's hand, not blood, but dust disturbed, as if someone had steadied themselves while walking. That detail confirmed he was on the right path. Minutes passed, measured not by a clock, but the steady rhythm of his breathing and steps. The deeper he moved into the service wing, the more he became aware of another, subtler pressure, resistance that was not yet visible, but already present, the sense that whatever caused the camera gap might also affect how this discovery would be received if reported. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the immediate task. The passage ahead ended in a heavy maintenance door, the paint older here, the metal slightly warped with age. A thin line of light showed beneath it. The guard slowed, listening carefully. From the other side came the faintest sound, not voices, not movement, but the soft, irregular rhythm of someone breathing close enough to the door that the sound carried through the metal. He placed his hand lightly on the handle, feeling the coolness of the steel, and paused, knowing that whatever waited beyond this door would confirm that the incident was no longer a minor irregularity, but something far more serious.
The guard turned the handle slowly, applying only enough pressure to test the latch before committing to the movement. The door opened inward with a muted scrape, revealing a narrow maintenance room lit by a single overhead fixture that hummed faintly, the light pale and uneven. The air inside was warmer than the corridor, carrying the dry smell of paper dust and electrical insulation. For a moment nothing moved. Then he saw the small figure seated on the floor beside a stack of covered storage crates, knees drawn close, one hand resting against the wall as if for balance. Prince Louis looked up, eyes wide but not panicked, the expression of a child who had not yet fully understood that he was somewhere he should not be. The guard stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him to prevent the sound from carrying into the passage. He removed his gloves before kneeling, keeping his movements deliberate and calm so as not to startle the boy. There was a faint abrasion on the prince's wrist and a small mark on his cheek, superficial but recent, as if he had stumbled in the dim light. The guard spoke quietly, asking if he was hurt, keeping his voice even and low.
The prince shook his head after a moment, though his breathing remained uneven, and said he had been trying to find his way back after waking in the night. The explanation came in fragments, as children often spoke when tired. He had heard voices somewhere beyond his room, voices that sounded angry, and curiosity, or perhaps unease, had drawn him into the corridor. The guard listened without interrupting, noting the details automatically: time of night, tone of voices described, direction the prince believed he had followed. The room itself showed no immediate sign of forced entry or disturbance, but the maintenance door's internal latch had been disengaged, allowing passage from the service corridor without authorization. That detail mattered. It meant someone had opened the way before the prince arrived, or had failed to secure it afterward. The guard guided the boy to his feet, checking that he could walk without pain, then offered his hand, not as a gesture of ceremony, but simply to steady him on the uneven floor. As they moved toward the door, the prince hesitated and looked back toward the dim corner of the room, as if remembering something he was unsure how to explain. When asked gently what he was thinking, he described hearing two adults arguing before he entered the passage, their voices low but sharp, speaking about documents that were not supposed to be moved yet. The guard felt a subtle tightening in his chest, not alarm but recognition that the incident had already shifted beyond the boundaries of a simple lapse in supervision. He did not question the prince further. A child's memory needed to be handled carefully, without pressure or suggestion. Instead, he focused on returning the boy safely to the residential wing, knowing that every step now carried implications that would extend far beyond this quiet room. The return journey through the service passage was slower, the guard adjusting his pace to the prince's shorter stride and watching carefully for any sign of fatigue or dizziness. The corridors seemed different now, no longer merely silent, but heavy with the knowledge that they had been used in ways not intended. At the junction where the inactive camera hung, the guard paused briefly, positioning himself so the prince did not notice the dark lens. He recorded the detail mentally again, fixing the exact location and angle in memory. Later, accuracy would matter more than speed. When they reached the secondary door leading back toward the nursery corridor, the guard opened it cautiously, scanning the main passage before stepping through. Morning activity had not yet begun. The palace remained in that narrow interval between night staff and day personnel, when movement was minimal and sound traveled farther than usual. He escorted the prince to a side sitting room adjacent to the nursery, rather than directly to the bedroom, following training that required a brief assessment before returning a minor to private quarters after an incident. A medical orderly was summoned quietly, the request phrased as a precaution to avoid unnecessary alarm. While waiting, the guard remained by the door, posture composed but senses alert, replaying the prince's words about the argument. The mention of restricted documents was not a phrase a child would invent easily, nor one likely to be overheard in ordinary household conversation. It suggested a discussion held in what the speakers believed to be a secure space, not a corridor within hearing distance of a royal residence. The implication was troubling. Either staff had grown careless, or they believed themselves protected by authority strong enough to ignore standard safeguards. When the orderly arrived and began a gentle examination, the guard stepped into the corridor, activating his radio at last to notify Central Security that the prince had been located and safe, omitting for the moment the details of the camera gap and the overheard conversation. Those elements required careful reporting, not hurried transmission over an open channel. The acknowledgment from control came quickly, routine in tone, unaware of the deeper irregularities already unfolding. The guard returned to the sitting room, where the prince now sat wrapped in a light blanket, calmer but visibly tired, eyes drifting toward the window where the first gray light of morning filtered through heavy curtains. Watching him, the guard felt the quiet weight of responsibility settle more firmly than before. The child had wandered because something within the palace had drawn him, voices raised in anger, doors left unsecured, systems interrupted without explanation. None of those failures were accidents that training alone could correct. As footsteps began to echo faintly in distant corridors, signaling the approach of the day shift, the guard understood that the real difficulty was only beginning. Reporting what he had seen would not simply trigger a security review, it would place him in the path of those who might prefer the incident to be reduced, simplified, or forgotten, and he could already sense that resistance would come sooner than expected. By mid-morning, the palace had returned to its outward rhythm, but the guard could feel the difference beneath the surface, the way one senses a change in air pressure before a storm. Reports had been filed, the prince examined and returned to rest, and the initial security log completed with precise language that avoided speculation. Yet before the formal review meeting had even been scheduled, a message arrived instructing him to attend a briefing in one of the smaller administrative chambers rather than the main security office. The location itself was unusual. Procedural reviews were normally conducted within the security wing, where recordings and logs were immediately accessible. The chamber was quiet when he entered, the curtains partially drawn against the pale winter light, a long polished table reflecting the muted glow of overhead fixtures. 2 senior administrative officials were already present, not members of the Guard Command, but civilian authorities responsible for internal operations. Their manner was courteous, controlled, but their questions moved quickly toward narrowing the scope of the incident. They referred to the event as an instance of temporary lapse in child supervision, emphasizing the prince's minor injuries and the absence of any external threat. The guard answered carefully, keeping his tone neutral, but when he mentioned the inactive camera and the prince's statement about overheard voices, the atmosphere in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. One official made a brief note, then closed the folder in front of him, saying that such details could complicate matters unnecessarily and should be verified before inclusion in any formal record. The phrasing was precise, not an order but a suggestion delivered with the weight of authority. The guard understood the implication. The report could be simplified, the unexplained elements deferred, the matter resolved quietly. He felt the familiar tension between obedience and judgment, a tension every guard was trained to manage, yet rarely in circumstances where the safety of a child intersected with the reputation of the institution itself. The meeting ended with instructions to file an amended summary focusing on the prince's unauthorized movement and recovery, omitting references to surveillance gaps until technical confirmation could be obtained. As he left the chamber, the guard was aware that nothing in the exchange had been openly improper. No rule had been broken in words. Yet the effect was unmistakable, a narrowing of truth, subtle but deliberate. Walking back through the long corridor toward the security wing, he listened to the sounds of the palace resuming its daily life, distant conversation, the faint clatter of service carts, the muffled toll of a clock marking the hour. All of it seemed normal, yet he could not dismiss the image of the dark camera lens and the quiet, matter-of-fact way the prince had described the argument. Procedure required him to follow the instruction he had been given, but instinct, sharpened by years of training to notice what others overlooked, told him that closing the report now would leave something unresolved, and unresolved matters in a place like this had a way of returning at greater cost. The guard spent the next hour reviewing the original logs again, this time with the knowledge that his findings might never be formally pursued. The control room was dim, lit mostly by the glow of monitors cycling through corridors and courtyards, each image steady, orderly, reassuring in its regularity. He isolated the 11-minute gap once more, comparing system timestamps, power records, and access points. The interruption had been precise, limited to a narrow segment of the network, and restored without triggering the automated alerts designed to prevent exactly such blind intervals. That degree of control suggested familiarity with internal systems, not a random malfunction. As he worked, a senior officer from the Guard Command entered, pausing beside his station. The officer's expression was composed, but carried a trace of weariness, as if already aware of the direction events were taking. He informed the guard that administrative authorities intended to close the matter as a supervisory lapse unless further evidence emerged, and that persisting to pursue alternative explanations without authorization could be viewed as exceeding assigned duties. The statement was delivered calmly, without threat, yet the meaning was clear. Persistence would bring scrutiny, perhaps disciplinary review. After the officer left, the guard remained seated, hands resting lightly on the console, listening to the low hum of equipment and the distant echo of footsteps in the corridor outside. He thought of the prince alone in the dim service passage, drawn there by voices that should never have been raised within hearing of a child. He considered the maintenance door left unsecured, the camera gap that no one seemed eager to examine, the careful language of the morning's meeting. None of these details proved wrongdoing by themselves, yet together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. He printed a copy of the unedited log and secured it in a sealed envelope, marking it for restricted retention, a step permitted under regulations but seldom used. It was not an act of defiance, only of preservation, ensuring that the record existed in full should it be needed later. As he prepared to leave the control room, a message arrived instructing all personnel involved in the incident to refrain from further independent inquiries pending administrative review. The guard read the message twice, noting its precise wording, then acknowledged receipt. Outwardly, nothing had changed. He would continue his assigned duties, maintain his post, and follow orders as required. Yet inwardly, he understood that the matter was no longer simply about documenting an incident. It had become a question of responsibility, whether protecting the institution's appearance justified leaving unanswered the circumstances that had placed a child at risk. Standing at his post later that afternoon, watching the quiet movement of staff through the corridor, he felt the steady weight of that question settle, knowing that sooner or later he would have to decide which obligation carried greater authority.
The decision did not come suddenly. It formed over the course of the afternoon, shaped by small observations that, taken alone, might have meant nothing. A revised incident summary circulated through internal channels, its language carefully narrowed, omitting the surveillance interruption and reducing the prince's account to a brief reference to unclear auditory stimuli. The guard read the document once, then again, noting not only what had been removed, but how smoothly the omissions fit into the official tone. Anyone reading it later would see only a minor lapse, already corrected, requiring no further attention. He stood at his post in the residential corridor as evening approached, the tall windows reflecting a sky fading from pale gray to blue. The air carried the faint warmth of radiators coming to life, and the quiet footsteps of household staff echoed softly on the marble floor. Outwardly, the palace was unchanged, composed, efficient, yet the guard could not dismiss the sense that something essential was being allowed to disappear, not evidence of a crime, perhaps, but evidence of vulnerability. He reviewed the reporting structure in his mind, recalling the clauses rarely invoked but still binding. In matters concerning the direct safety of a royal minor, any officer of the guard retained the right to request audience with a senior member of the royal household if normal channels were compromised.
The provision existed precisely for situations in which administrative processes might fail to act with sufficient urgency. Invoking it, however, carried consequences. It would be seen as bypassing established hierarchy, a step interpreted by some as distrust of superiors. The guard understood that such actions did not pass unnoticed, and careers had been quietly redirected for less. Still, the image of the prince sitting alone in the maintenance room remained fixed in his thoughts, more persuasive than any regulation. Near dusk, he submitted a formal request through the secure internal system, concise and factual, asking permission to brief Princess Anne on a matter concerning residential security and child protection. The response came sooner than he expected. Authorization granted, audience scheduled for the following hour in a private study overlooking the inner courtyard. The guard arrived precisely on time, escorted through corridors that grew quieter and more secluded as he approached the residential wing reserved for senior members of the family. The study itself was modest by palace standards, lined with shelves of well-worn volumes, a single lamp casting warm light across a large desk. Princess Anne stood near the window when he entered, the fading daylight outlining her figure against the glass. She turned, acknowledging him with a brief nod that conveyed attention rather than ceremony, and invited him to speak. The guard delivered his account in measured sequence, beginning with the discovery of the toy in the corridor, continuing through the search, the finding of the prince, the inactive camera, and the conversation overheard in the night. He did not speculate, did not assign motives, only presented what he had seen and heard, each detail placed carefully, like entries in a log that could not be altered once recorded. Throughout the briefing she remained silent, her expression steady, asking only occasional precise questions about timing or location. When he finished, the room was quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock on the mantel, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Princess Anne moved to the desk and reviewed the printed log he had brought, her eyes moving slowly across the timestamps and annotations. The guard stood at attention, aware of the significance of the silence. This was no longer an internal security discussion. It was a matter placed directly before a member of the royal household, with all the implications that carried. At last, she set the document down and asked a single question, whether in her professional judgment the incident represented an ongoing risk. The guard answered without hesitation that the combination of unexplained surveillance failure, unsecured access points, and apparent attempts to minimize the report indicated a vulnerability that had not yet been resolved. He chose his words carefully, aware that certainty was impossible, but the duty to protect required acting before certainty was achieved. She regarded him for several seconds, measuring not only the content of his answer, but the manner in which it was given. There was no trace of urgency in his tone, only steady conviction, the kind that came from observation rather than emotion. Finally, she nodded once, as if confirming a conclusion already forming in her mind. She thanked him for bringing the matter forward and instructed him to provide a full written account directly to her office, unedited and complete. The instruction was calm, almost understated, yet its significance was unmistakable. The information would not be confined to administrative channels. As the guard prepared to leave, she added that until further notice, he was to refrain from discussing the briefing with anyone except his immediate commanding officer, and that she would address the matter personally. He acknowledged the order and departed, the quiet corridors seeming different now, not lighter but clearer, as if the act of speaking the truth had shifted the balance of uncertainty. Yet he was also aware that the consequences of bypassing intermediate authority would soon become visible. By the time he reached the outer corridor, a message was already waiting on his secure device, requesting clarification of his movements during the past hour, an inquiry routine in appearance but precise in timing. The guard understood that word of his audience had traveled quickly and that scrutiny would follow. Still, as he resumed his post that evening, the palace settling into the subdued stillness of night, he felt no regret. The decision had not been an act of defiance, but of responsibility, and whatever response awaited him in the days ahead, the essential fact remained unchanged. The safety of the child had been placed above the comfort of procedure, and the truth of the incident now rested where it could not be quietly set aside.
The effect of the briefing became visible the following morning, not through announcements, but through subtle changes in movement and tone. Security officers who normally remained at fixed posts were reassigned in quiet rotations, and access to several internal systems was temporarily restricted pending what was described as a routine audit. The language was neutral, but the guard recognized the signs of a controlled intervention. By mid-morning, a formal notice circulated from Princess Anne's office ordering an independent security review of the residential wing with immediate effect and full access to surveillance logs, maintenance records, and administrative correspondence. The notice carried the authority to override internal objections, and within an hour, several officials responsible for facility operations were instructed to step aside from their duties until the review was complete. The guard observed these developments from a distance, maintaining his assigned position, outwardly unchanged, though aware that the sequence of events had begun precisely because he had chosen to speak. The palace corridors felt different that day, quieter in a way that came not from stillness, but from attention. Conversations lowered as people passed one another, and doors that were usually left open were now closed more carefully. Investigators from the independent review team arrived shortly before noon, moving methodically through the service passages with portable equipment, verifying timestamps, testing access controls, and examining the camera node that had gone dark during the night of the incident. The guard was asked to provide a detailed walkthrough of his search route, retracing each step from the discovery of the toy to the maintenance room. He led them without embellishment, describing only what he had seen and heard, allowing the physical environment to speak for itself. The narrowness of the corridor, the inactive lens, the door that had been secured from the inside. Watching the investigators work, he felt a restrained sense of relief. The matter was no longer confined to memory or contested interpretation, but was being examined with the discipline of evidence. Yet relief was tempered by another awareness. The administrative offices affected by the review would not overlook the role he had played in initiating it. That awareness became more concrete when, later that afternoon, he was summoned to a disciplinary consultation with his commanding officer. The meeting was conducted with formal courtesy, the officer acknowledging the accuracy of his report, while also noting that bypassing established reporting layers constituted a breach of protocol requiring review. The guard accepted the statement without argument. He understood that institutions depended on order as much as individuals depended on judgment, and that even necessary actions could carry consequences. Leaving the office, he felt neither vindicated nor condemned, only conscious that the process now unfolding would determine not only the outcome of the investigation, but the course of his own service. The independent review concluded its preliminary findings within 48 hours, a pace made possible by the narrow focus of the inquiry and the clarity of the physical evidence. The surveillance interruption, investigators determined, had not been caused by equipment failure, but by a manual override executed from an internal terminal accessible only to a limited group of authorized personnel. Maintenance records showed that the service door latch had been disengaged during the same interval, and internal communications recovered from archived logs confirmed that certain documents had been moved between offices without proper authorization on that night. The argument overheard by the prince, though never fully reconstructed, was consistent with the timeline established by the investigation. These findings were presented in a closed briefing attended by senior members of the household and guard command, after which several officials were formally suspended pending further proceedings. The palace resumed its outward routine gradually, but new safeguards were implemented quietly. Additional escorts for the residential wing at night, redundant monitoring of surveillance nodes, and revised procedures requiring dual authorization for any system override within areas occupied by the royal children. The guard returned to regular duty, his schedule unchanged, though he remained aware that his own disciplinary review was still pending. When it concluded, the determination was delivered in a brief written notice. His decision to bypass intermediate reporting channels was judged to have violated procedural hierarchy, but was mitigated by the accuracy of his information and the necessity of immediate action in a matter involving the safety of a minor. The notice ended with a formal caution, not a reprimand, and authorization to continue in his current post. The language was measured, almost austere, yet the meaning was clear. Protocol had been bent, but not broken beyond repair. On a quiet evening some days later, as the guard stood at his position near the residential corridor, he saw Prince Louis pass with his tutor, walking at an unhurried pace, the child's movements steady, the small abrasion on his wrist already faded. The prince glanced briefly toward the guard, offering a small, wordless nod of recognition before continuing down the corridor. The exchange lasted only a second, but it carried a quiet completeness, a reminder of what had been at stake. The palace lights reflected softly on the marble floor, and beyond the tall windows the sky darkened into night. Standing there in the steady silence, the guard understood that the balance between duty and procedure would never be simple, and that the true measure of service was not in avoiding conflict, but in recognizing, when the moment came, which obligation must stand above the rest.